Hi, everyone. All right, just checking my audio. Can everyone hear me? You can just post in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself.
I can hear you.
Good. Turn up my volume. Okay, I'm still waiting for everyone to join. There's about 13 of you here right now. I know it's more than that. I don't want to get started because I'm going to have to keep looking in the waiting room to let people in, which will kind of distract me a little bit. So I'm just going to wait until everybody is here before I get started. Right there. Okay. Wait, did we lose somebody? How's everybody feeling today?
Everybody's great. How you feeling?
I'm good.
That's good. That's good.
I'm on a quasi level of productivity today.
Okay.
I have days where I work almost the entire day. So I work about 12 hours and then I balance that with days where I just work intermittently. So today is one of my intermittent days. All right, I think this is almost everyone now. Okay. All right. All right. So based on the surveys completed, there was about 19 of you, but I do understand that it might be something like 22. I will just jump in. What was that? I'll just jump in and get started in the event that they're starting a little bit late. Oh, here we go. Oh, here we go. All right. So we are about at the capacity that we had set out for. So good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tiffany A. Bain. I am a learning designer by trade in the space of education. I never considered myself a teacher. I guess I was raised in education in what we call flexible context design. Graduate certificate in education with the University of Southern Queensland, who has their general education platform. It is based in flexible design. So even though I've done formal classroom instruction for more than 15 years, my learning design background has always been in flexible design. So my specialization is curriculum and pedagogy. But right now I work as an education, youth, and community program consultant with the Organization for Responsible Governance. All right. And so I'm really happy to be able to bring this workshop to you. We're going to be walking through what is called the ADDIE model: analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate, which is essentially the traditional learning design model that you would use to create learning design for a flexible context. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. I also did take note. I went over the survey that you submitted, because I wanted to have a realistic idea of who, like your comfort levels and where you were at this point. And so your comfort levels actually range greatly with the larger number of you feeling less comfortable with learning design in a flexible context or moving to online learning. And I will tell you, even though this feels the same for some of you, learning design for flexible learning or flexible context actually has a different, it's a different set of skills. So it's often a different set of training that you would have to do this. So if you can do learning design for flexible context, it's easy to teach in a regular classroom. But if you have just been trained for a regular classroom environment, it might be a little more difficult to transition to flexible context because there are a number of considerations that you just aren't in practice of having. So it's not that it's beyond your reach or something that's outside of your skill set. It's just not a set of ideas that you might be accustomed to thinking about. And so that's why we're going to use the ADDIE model for you to begin kind of just like rethinking about how you do learning and instruction. All right. So I'm using my phone because this is where I have my notes because I'm sharing my screen with you. So please forgive me as I look up and down because this is where my notes live. All right. So does anybody have any special questions before we get started? No, is all open book? All right, sounds great. Let's jump in. So as I mentioned, my name is Tiffany Abing. I'm an education consultant and specialist. I have about 15 years in education. I keep losing count so that I might say what that. I graduated from college originally in 2004. So whatever that math turns out to be. My undergraduate degree is in international studies, but as I mentioned, I have a postgraduate certificate in education with a concentration in curriculum and pedagogy. And I also have a master's in child, youth, and family studies with a focus on nonprofit management and youth development. All right. So our goals for the workshop are to understand and implement the use of the ADDIE model in learning design. And our objectives are to introduce the stages of the ADDIE model, to understand and apply each of the steps in ADDIE to the learning design process, and then to review a completed lesson, which includes an introduction, learning activities, and some sort of assessment. Okay, so jumping right into our first objective. So ADDIE, as I mentioned, is a classic model which is used in instructional design. It identifies the steps that are used in creating a lesson. So a lesson, a unit, or a module in what we call a flexible context. So flexible context refers to any mode of instruction that happens out of a traditional classroom. ADDIE ensures that all of the steps that are needed in creating this lesson for the flexible context would be followed. So it would give equitable access or equal or fair access to all of the students who are in your space, and it reduces the challenges that any particular student would have in having technology as the instructional medium, which is compared to like just being in the classroom with a teacher. So by being in a classroom with your students, there are opportunities that you're able to take advantage of that you just don't have when you are using technology, which is why there is a thought process and a degree of planning that comes at the beginning of that to make sure that you cover your bases. So this method is highly effective because it is designed in a way that all students may have access to learning materials, regardless of when and where they are learning from. And it also has built-in ways for you to kind of check in as to whether students will need further support. The ADDIE model is actually not drastically different from the process which you go through to create your lessons or your units. Educators who are more experienced in their craft actually probably spend a lot less time creating lessons. you can probably design lessons without even actively thinking about them or writing them down. But in the ADDIE process, you actively think about what your lesson goals are because it helps you to cover all of your bases to make sure you've given access to each stage of instruction in order for a student to be able to complete a task or an activity. So better understanding the learning goals. Understanding those steps means better understanding you, better understanding the learning goals, and also communicating what those learning goals are or objectives are. So when you do that, it's beneficial to you as a teacher because then you get to prioritize exactly what it is that you're going to be evaluating or marking in the activity. The students will have it so that they can readily look at an assignment or an activity and figure out what it is that they're supposed to be learning from this. And as teachers, we're all guilty of sometimes giving an assignment that has like a vague or ambiguous set of goals attached to it. And then we just kind of, I know in the case of work that is like sometimes content driven, you give an assignment. So you give like a reading passage and then you ask questions. And it feels like you've measured the student learning in those cases, but often what you're measuring is like reading comprehension. If this is a science activity, if this is a language arts or a math activity, is reading comprehension your actual goal? So are you able to measure that the students have acquired the skill if you've rooted your entire lesson in reading comprehension? So it makes you think about what your objectives are and designing those activities very specific to target the skill that you are actually trying to measure. And so, especially in a flexible context, when you have clear objectives, parents can understand what the content and skills are that the kids are supposed to be getting from this activity. And if they are in a position where they are supporting their students, their children, they can actually do that. I know I had one experience early in school closures where my daughter's teacher sent an assignment and she just asked for her to write, she just gave a writing prompt. And again, being an educator myself, my question was like, okay, what are we measuring here? Because for me, I need to know if we are looking at grammar, if we are looking at writing development, what stage of writing development? Like what has she done so far? Does she understand the idea of main idea and details? Is she working on some sort of writing sandwich? I don't know what skills it is that she has right now that should be the focus of this activity, but it was just like, do a writing prompt and you're going to mark this. Because then my other question is, because I, as the parent, the person who's delivering this, I don't even know what to have her focus on to get the best possible grade. So we're actively thinking about this in this way, and you kind of have to think like, is the set of instructions, is the activity truly fair to my students, considering I haven't communicated all of the information to them. All right, so I'm going to play a really quick video about, I'm going to play a really quick video about what ADDIE is.
The foundation of the instructional design process is the ADDIE process. ADDIE is made up of 5 steps: analyze, design,
Develop, implement, and elevate.
The first step is analyze, and this first step is necessary to identify the problem that you'll be providing a solution for, as well as identifying learning goals, your learners and their needs, and the time frame for the entire development process. The second step is design. In this step, the learning goals are transformed into clear learning objectives. The content is decided upon by sketching out storyboards and wireframes, and scripts are written for any videos or voiceovers. The third step is develop. In this step, the storyboards and wireframes are used to help create the actual content that will be used in the module. It's at this stage when videos and voiceovers are recorded and edited as well. The fourth step is implement. In this step, the completed course or instructional activity is implemented in a classroom for students to use. This can be a pilot test or the actual launch of the course or instructional activity. The fifth and final step is evaluate. In this step, coded and reviewed. This is where you find out if the problem you are trying to resolve is in fact resolved due to the course or instructional activity that you implemented. It's at this stage that you might choose to revise your course or instructional activity due to the feedback and data from the implementation. The ADDIE process is widely used by instructional designers and is a useful process when creating almost any part of curriculum, big or small. Each step is a critical part of the process and helps the next step be successful.
All right, do you guys have any questions about that? I can't actually see let me pull this up so I can see anybody. So I can see a hand raised if you're using one, but you can just unmute your mic because I actively have to kind of like scroll through these to see if anybody has questions. No? All right, so as I mentioned, I hope that video didn't intimidate you at all, but I'm going to go through a kind of like simplified version of how ADDIE is implemented. Was that a question? No? Okay. Okay, so I would have sent out several documents to you, the first of which is translating ADDIE. So if you can just open up this document for me. All right. So I want you to reflect a little bit on the ADDIE process and your normal process for creating lessons. As I mentioned, you are a seasoned professional, which some of you are. You've been doing this for a while, especially if you still teach the same grade level. It's easy to just kind of teach lessons out of memory because you're just so accustomed to it. So I just want you to take a couple of minutes to like stop and truly reflect on your process. I want you to compare the steps that you take to the analyzation process of it. So before the lesson, how do you know what prior knowledge and skills your students have? When you're creating what that lesson or activity is going to be, what specific skills and content are you expecting your students to learn? Like, how do you get to this place where you decide that? How will they practice it? How will they demonstrate their knowledge? In your development process, how do you select which content that you're going to use? And how do you verify the effectiveness of it? Now, mind you, some of this you may think about well ahead of time. These may be in the process of like selecting a textbook or not selecting or just deciding which textbook to use at which point. Implementation is essentially the teaching of the class, and the evaluation process is like, how do you design your assessment? How do you figure out which type of tests and assessments you're going to use to monitor your student learning? So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to like think deeply about this process, okay? All right, Alexa, give me a 5-minute timer.
5 minutes, starting now.
Okay. Alexa, how much time on the timer?
You have 1 minute and 50 seconds left on your 5-minute timer.
All right. Alexa, stop. All right, that is our time. Does anybody want to share your process? This is a shy group.
Any takers?
Don't make me whip out my roster and just start calling
Good
names.
morning, everyone.
Hi.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone.
All right.
Morning, my sweetie.
Who is that? Are we sharing?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay. Well, I know for science, most of the times, I'll just start off with some of the things. To get the information on what we're about to teach our students, we use games and curriculum. That's the first thing we use. And then I often just ask students basic questions. And one of the final things that I use is a generic method of what students are now interested in today. You know, most of them are into technology, most of them are into specific games. And so that would be kind of a jump off spot for me. But I'll ask, like, who's into a specific game? Let's say the games the last time I taught was using Nintendo, so using the PS3. They seem to know the PS3. And so because I'm in science and technology,
Okay.
I will go from there. Or even as far as, let's say, we're taking from teaching motion. What is motion? So if you're sitting in a car, so from there, that's how I gather my information. And then
Okay.
so I'll know what to teach.
So in your analyze process, the first thing you would do is actually just prompt your students and ask them about what skills and resources they have before you would design a lesson around that resource.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, that's a very practical strategy. I think it's advantageous, especially at this grade level, because these are things that you can actually just ask your students.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, I said that's very practical, given that the grade level that this is, that you can take advantage of just being able to ask students.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. All right, does anybody want to comment on the design process, deciding on the specific skills and content that they're expecting students to learn? How do you know when you pick up, so you're going through the syllabus and you're like, okay, this is a topic that we have to do. How do you figure out how you are going to, or what set of skills you are going to prepare this? I know your forecast and your scope and sequences often just include content areas. It doesn't often focus on specific skills. So how do you then decide, in this content area, I'm going to work on these skills? Because even when you look at something like in language arts, you're saying nouns, what specific skills will you be looking for? Like, how do you decide whether this is an introduction to the use of nouns, where this is the application of the use of nouns? Like, how do you decide what it is that you're going to do? Does anybody want to share on a process like that? No? What about developing a lesson?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I don't know if everybody's shy. Teachers, she would know what you're thinking unless you speak. As far as designing, we have our schemes that are developed at the beginning of the year where we specify the specific skills and the content that we want the students to learn. So when we're designing our lessons, we would refer back, or we should be referring back to our themes that we would have developed for that particular class set.
Okay. So the designing and development are essentially interconnected because you would have planned this out perhaps earlier in the school year.
Mm-hmm.
And is it fair to say that the evaluation process would also happen at that same point? You would decide, this is what we're going to, either in the lesson, this is what I'm going to test. But Chantel, where are you?
You have two Chantels. You have to
Kurdish?
specify which one. You
Did
have
I
two
make that up?
Chantels.
Oh man, there was a Chantel who raised her hand.
Yeah, that's me. Can you hear me?
I can, yes, very clearly.
Okay, good. Usually for me, when it comes to designing for my lesson, one of the things I try to parallel, because we use a workbook. So let's say I'm going to decide to do a PowerPoint, or I want to use a PowerPoint. I have to parallel with what's in the workbook. So at the end of the day, whatever I pull out there to try and be visual, to connect with the students at some point when they begin to sit with their independent work, I have to make sure that this information wasn't just created in isolation, but it's something that's going to be helpful for the students to help them to perform in whatever it is they're going to do independently or collaboratively as a group. So normally for me, I like to, I don't just use the content in terms of my schemes and the curriculum itself, but I like to, if we're using a workbook, because I know for I do religion and we normally have a workbook that the kids normally have to work out of. And so I normally try to pull from that as well in creating my slides. And in some instances, a slide may not be the best thing to use for the lesson itself.
Okay, good stuff, right. So you have done some sort of evaluation of the resources that you have. You don't just say, this is the book that we're using and I'm going to assign this activity. So great. So you are already kind of using some of the skills that are necessary in the ADDIE model, all right? Awesome. All right, so let's move on.
To develop.
No, that's not what I wanted. Don't do that. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to essentially walk you through each of the steps of this model. So the first one is analyze, which means establishing what the instructional goals are of sorts, but you're more thinking about like who's your student, what skills and resources would they have, especially in this context, and what will they require to be able to have minimal and very fundamental access to your lesson. So in a traditional classroom environment, you operate under a number of assumptions. And number one is typically that your students have completed and acquired the necessary skills from some sort of previous grade or previous lesson in order to receive the current lesson or the one that you're about to teach. And that they also have the resources, which would be like books, pens, pencils, in order to complete the activities that you're going to put before them. In a flexible environment, you actually have to give a lot more thought to the needs that your students may have because you cannot meet immediately satisfy those. So you have to think kind of ahead about what it is that they would need. So thinking about your students' needs and the resources and skills they will have is actually a bit of a continuous process. You may need to find yourself adding to them throughout the process, and that's absolutely fine. It's going to feel tedious as we walk through this, but a lot of our practice is actually very tedious. But when you are in good form, when you are in good practice, these things you happen to do without even actively thinking about them. And so you want to kind of like just prime yourself for thinking about them in that way that we do so many things without actively thinking about them because we are in practice. So let's start thinking about your students a little bit, all right? So you're gonna go to the next sheet that I gave you, which is the ADDIE template. Well, I only gave you 2 handouts, so it's the other one. All right, and I want you to, again, you can just start thinking about what core resources will your students need to have to be able to access your lessons from their homes right now, all right? What core resources will they essentially have, all right? So just think about that and you can begin jotting them down. Because again, this is something that you have to actively think about. When the ministry launched a lot of the learning opportunities that existed, this wasn't something that was at the fore. This became an afterthought. There were several assumptions that we were operating under, but we hadn't actively thought about them, because had we done so, the virtual learning aspect of the school would have launched simultaneously with, for example, like a workbook version of what that would look like, as well as the learning channel. So that's why we have to think about these, who would have core access to these materials, and what do we need to do to be able to give that to them. All right, and so you guys are gonna have some things like students are going to need internet access or data access. They're going to need some sort of device, which is a tablet, a phone, or a computer. And minimally, they're going to need some sort of word processor. So some sort of application in which they can edit documents that are sent to them. And in the cases where you're deciding to be super flexible with your students, as in they don't have some of these things, they might have access to something or someone that can print these things out, or have a scanner or a camera. So the student that's just looking at a worksheet that's on a screen may be able to write out their answers and take a picture and send it to the teacher. So thinking about it in that very flexible way, which also means that teachers need to be pretty flexible and adaptive about how work comes back to them, and not create what we call inequities by having an expectation that students do things a very specific way. So if you send a worksheet out and your students can't send that worksheet back to you, they shouldn't be penalized, because that might be an issue of access. And you don't want to grade your students based on what their access would be as opposed to what their skills are. All right? So now we also need to think about, like, what core skills will your students need to complete it? We've established that they need internet access. We've established that they have these tablets in front of them. We've established that they have a word processor in front of them. But now what skills would they need to kind of like match up with these resources? All right. And so that actually takes us to students are going to need to be able to know how to use the internet. They're going to need to know how to type into a Word document, how to create an email, how to create an attachment or upload an attachment in an email or in a message. They're going to maybe need to know how to print. So does that all make sense? All right. So yeah, these are just minimally things that your students are going to need if they're going to have access to your classes in a flexible context. But I will say, you will have students who will not have access to any of these. And those students will probably be the exception and not the rule. What that means is, no, we're not going to ignore those students, but what that does mean is the school or the student, the teacher collectively, you will need to figure out what are the ways that we now have to adapt how we are delivering our learning to meet the needs of these students. And that might mean we are just engaging them in a way that we might not be able to measure their learning. We may just create completely compiled workbooks with all of the information that we're sending to them, which is like creating a distance learning strategy in which you do some sort of summative evaluation that is probably either authentic in nature or project-based, where you can just kind of like get an idea of all of the skills that you would have taught them via the distance instruction, and you are still able to measure the learning, all right? So if you were teaching science and you were looking at the experiment, the steps of conducting an experiment, you can send that assignment out. You can send a written version of that into the woods with all of the lessons that are there and compiled with activities for students to do. But then your assessment for that would be, your students would then either have to demonstrate the execution of some experiment in which they can just write all of the steps that they've carried out and send that back to you. And you are able to measure exactly what it is the student has learned in achieving that objective without having to monitor all of the individual steps. Is that something that makes sense to you? All right, so because this is a really quiet crew, I am going to accept silence as consent. All right, so only when I hear your responses will I establish that there is some level of dissent, all right? Otherwise, I really need you to speak up because I want to make sure everybody completely understands what I'm saying. So I know Grand Bahama has had recent experiences with Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so Grand Bahama has had recent experiences with hurricanes. Are there any very specific contexts that your students are experiencing that I should probably know about? I know in New Providence, we definitely have internet access as a primary issue. There were assumptions that all students had some sort of internet access or data access. There were assumptions that because students use phones for social media, they already know how to use phones for other functional uses. And I imagine this applies to you as well. But do you have any other like extraordinary circumstances that I should know about? Because I don't want to be insensitive to your contact. No, pretty much touched on the bases.
Some persons don't have power since Hurricane Dorian.
Yeah.
And so you may have situations where your flexible context might be a distance learning module, which is you give access to all of the resources, and then you may just have to design more authentic or project-based assessments to be able to measure the learning that students should have been able to acquire. But the process that you'll go through is essentially the same thing. Your implementation or your delivery method would just be to be able to not use technology, maybe in some cases, or minimize your use of technology, and have either transcripts and kind of like video or almost like a comic version of the lesson that you would have had delivered by video. Do like a comic strip version of it so that they get the same information at the same time, and then you use a project-based strategy. and project-based learning and authentic assessments is a whole other workshop. I just want to plant that idea that this still works for them, okay? All right, so we move on to the next step, which is design. We've already thought about who our students are a little bit. So now we need to get a little bit more specific about what are our learning goals, and what instructional strategies might we actually use in order to achieve what our learning goals are. And then also think about like, what might an assessment look like? How am I going to measure my students' learning in this space? Okay, so I'm a social science specialist. And did I ask you to do that? I don't remember that I asked you to do that. So you are most likely, when, as we talked about before, when you start creating a lesson, you're most likely working from some sort of syllabus or scope or sequence or curriculum map to decide what it is you're going to be teaching. Typically, you start off with either a content or a skill in this space. That's just where we start off. So I pretty much did the same thing. While I just picked a topic out of the book to use as the example for you. And as I mentioned, I'm a social science specialist. And so I just chose chapter 8 from Bahamian History, book 2. I also chose this topic. I also chose to do history very specifically because history, like some sciences, can be very content driven. So I want you to see the process that I went through to figure out how I will choose a skill to teach to drive this very specific content, all right? And the reason I am going with a skill, I'm leading with a skill and not the content is because when you lead with content, you are relying on the skill of recall, and recall isn't a strategy you can actually teach, all right? So having a student remember something very specifically, the reason it is the lowest rung of when we talk about the when we talk about like the hierarchy of learning, when we're looking at that, the reason recall and remembering is such a low level skill is because it's the one that we actually have the least amount of control over. People have varying levels of their ability to remember things, and you can't, it's not a fair skill at all, okay? So you can't necessarily, as a teacher, credit your instruction to a student's ability to recall. That's why we're gonna start off with skills. All right, so I showed you what my content area was. It's Woodes Rogers' term as Royal Governor. So what I actually did was go to the BGCSE syllabus to identify what skills I will teach. And it's very complicated language. So I'm using, if the kids were able to get an A, all candidates for the BGCSE would be able to. And I'm gonna pull the first skill, which is recall, select, and deploy relevant historical knowledge accurately to support a coherent and logical argument. I'm going to simplify that, all right? Again, they identify recall as a skill, but I will tell you, your student's ability to recall is more connected to the levels of stimulation that they have with the content than your ability to drive that. So how many times do they use it? The level of cognition that is associated with the content of that is a better determinant of their ability to remember it than you saying it a million times or reading it a million times and then giving them a test on it. That's completely different. So if they've been able to apply this learning, they have a better chance of actually being able to recall, okay? So I'm going to change the skill into more workable language, or I'm going to change my outcome, which I've converted the skill to, into more workable language, which is select and use historical knowledge accurately to support an argument. And boom, that's going to be essentially the outcome of my lesson. That's it. Select and use historical knowledge accurately to support an argument. So that's a pretty fair skill, right? When the students look at the lesson, they can say, okay, I know what it is that I'm going to do. If a parent is looking over their child's essay or whatever the activity is, they can say, you're not using enough evidence from this. This is not historically accurate. So everybody can identify what it is that you're supposed to be doing. All right, So now that I've figured out what my overall outcome is, I need to identify what my objectives are. So if we say the outcome is your essential recipe, like what it is that you're gonna have. So guava duck. So my outcome is my guava duck. My objectives are going to be my ingredients and steps, right? So I have to still figure out, okay, what do I need to do? Like how much? Well, the resources will be the how much, but I need to crack eggs. I need a bowl. I need to mix. So that's what my objectives are going to be able to get me to this guava duck. Again, we've all gone through the academic process of using outcomes and objectives, and we don't necessarily deploy them in our consistent practice. In ADDIE, you cannot neglect them. You have to actively think about them. And again, while this may seem tedious at the beginning of it, your lessons will go so smoothly. Like you can plan your lessons at home or at the end of your day and in your planning periods. And in your classroom, you are spending, even if you use this in a regular classroom environment, you will spend most of your lesson literally monitoring kids and being able to identify where they are experiencing challenges instead of using that time to give the first set of instructions. So this right here contributes to like your classroom management. This right here contributes to your ability to have differentiated instruction because you can walk around a classroom and see where a student is struggling in a very specific objective and maybe even modify their activity for them because you were able to acknowledge what they were having challenges with. All right, so now that I've given some thought to what my outcome is, again, I need to identify what are my steps toward my outcome or my guava duck. So first, they're obviously going to need to read this chapter. So my first outcome, my first objective is read and become familiar with the events of Woodes Rogers' term as governor. And that's it. Boom. That's what I need them to be able to do. Then I'm like, okay, so they've read this. I'm probably going to need them to make notes of specific or significant events. So my second objective is going to be identify and organize the key events of his term as governor during this time. So simply as that, that's my second objective. Then I want them to choose some sort of position on formulate some sort of founded opinion on the success of his term. So my third objective is going to be evaluate the events of Woodes Rogers' term and form some sort of position on them. Was it good? Was it bad? Was it effective? Was it ineffective? And that's my third objective. So lastly, I'm going to need them to organize their information and structure their position some sort of way. So then my final objective is going to be organize your information into some sort of first draft argumentative essay. So that is my final objective. And these are the 4 objectives of my lesson. So again, I have my outcome is going to be read and become familiar with the, my outcome is select and use historical knowledge accurately to support an argument. And my objectives or my steps to get there, read and become familiar with the events of Woodes Rogers' term as governor, identify and organize key events during his time as governor, evaluate the events of Woodes Rogers' term, and then form a position on it. And then lastly, organize your information into some sort of first draft argumentative essay. Any questions on that process? I know that making that transition between outcomes and objectives is often one where we find ourselves out of practice. So this is definitely a good point to either write notes and you can send me an email later, but if you need any points of clarification, definitely feel free to make them.
I just want to, I was just trying to figure out how we can implement or adopt the ADDIE model into what we're doing already. As far as when we write our behavioral objectives, because we would write our behavioral objective, like at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to, the objective that you had, select and use whatever it was that was written. Can you go back to that slide?
Mhm.
So our behavioral objective is at the end of the lesson, we would want the student to be able to select and use historical knowledge accurately to support an argument.
Right.
And we may include some of these other actions
Mhm.
as a part of our behavioral objectives as well. So it seems with the ADDIE model, there's one overarching learning goal for that particular lesson. And then, you could correct me if I'm wrong, then you focus on breaking that goal into achievable steps, I
That's
guess.
exactly what you do. Because the
Okay, so you
outcome,
have an overall goal, and then you break it down into steps, step by step by step, so that you can achieve, so that the student at the end of the lesson would be able to achieve its goal.
yes,
Mm.
and that's precisely what you're doing. So the outcome is the what is going to happen by the end of this class, but the objectives are the how. How are they going to be able to do this? So a teacher who is in like your PE teacher is actively thinking about this, because at the end of their class, they're like, okay, you got to be able to play basketball. But then they know, I have to teach you how to dribble. I have to teach you how to shoot. You have to understand the rules of the game. And so teachers that are in those subjects, or the art teacher is doing this all the time, because they're like, I want you to be able to create an image that's similar to, or primitive image like Amos Ferguson. They know all of the steps that you have to do to get kids to do that. And because they are in practice of doing that, they walk the kids through the steps. But in other subject areas, because you can sometimes get kids to do what it is that you want by happenstance, we don't put as much emphasis on it. Because like, as long as you have some students who get it, you kind of like say, okay, everybody got it. But I know I have been in lessons myself where teachers are like, this is what I'm teaching. And then I've been in that lesson and I'm like, that's not what you taught. That's not what you taught in that lesson. That's what your topic was, but that's not what you taught. And as the previous example that I gave, you read over some material. You may have even like verbally reiterated that with graphics, and then you gave an assignment. But again, the only skill that you measured was reading comprehension, but your goal wasn't reading comprehension. Your goal was to like say, understand the development in language arts. So you're like, let's understand the character development of Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird, something like that. But then you just give a comprehension or a set of questions and they answer it. How do you know that they understood the character development? They didn't. Like, you talked about Boo Radley, you talked about some of the things that he did, but you didn't go through the process sufficiently where you know that what is character development? How do you identify it? Like, you didn't go through those very specific steps that gets you to what that outcome is. And again, because you can throw content out there and some kids get it by happenstance, the disparity often is that because you weren't teaching the lesson that you thought you were teaching, not everybody got it. All right?
So with the ADDIE model, you more focus, like you said, you lead with the skill in designing the lesson, not the content.
Exactly.
Not just because you cover the content, it means that you've taught the skill.
Exactly. Yeah. I like to think about it as think about it very specifically as a transfer of knowledge. Like, what knowledge were you trying to transfer it, and how do you measure that it was received? And like I said, there's always going to be kids who are going to get all of it, and maybe spit it back out to you, but can you fairly assess that they learned the thing that you wanted them to learn in that class? And that's how we disadvantage ourselves, by not doing this. Okay. All right. So now that I've gone through the process of identifying my content, I've identified my outcome and my objective. Again, I got my guava. I figured out what I need to do to make this guava. Now I need to figure out what are the actual ingredients to do these things, okay? So for each of my objectives, I'm going to identify a resource that I'm going to use to do this thing. And this goes through your, I'm going to go through my workbook. I'm going to go through the textbook and say, this is what I'm going to use, or I'm going to go to the internet and say, this is what I'm going to use. But not only am I doing that, there's going to be a stage where I'm going to vet whether or not that's the right thing. So, for example, objective 1, which is read and become familiar with the events of Woodes Rogers' term as governor, the first thing that I need to do is ensure that my kids have access to this passage, all right? So I will need to give them access to the chapter on Woodes Rogers' term as governor. I cannot operate under the assumption that all of the students have the textbook with them or that they purchased it. What I do not want to do, again, is measure privilege. We all have circumstances where students' parents have not purchased the textbook. I worked in an out-of-school program that's worked in a very specific district, and I had one school where like 98% of parents bought textbooks, and I went to another school where 98% of parents did not buy textbooks. And in the other schools, students were often incredibly disadvantaged. The question is like, this is now our context. What are we going to do to be able to meet our student needs? And not that, okay, my students are just gonna fail this because they didn't have the resources necessary to complete it. We then have to get adaptive because that's a part of our school context, all right? So boom, I have to give them this chapter. Second, I've identified and organized the key events during this time as governor. So that's our second objective. So I need to help them be able to figure out how to structure the information that they're getting from this. So either I'm going to give them some sort of timeline handout, some sort of event organizer, or some sort of video on how to take notes when they are reading through a textbook. So I'm not assuming that they already know how to do this. I'm going to give them those very specific resources. Then for number 3, I'm going to evaluate their events of, they're going to evaluate the events of Woodes Rogers' term and form an opinion about its success. Okay, we already know we all have the capacity to be able to form an opinion. This is a very early skill. The question is, can they actually use historical materials to organize that information? So what I'm going to give them is, I'm going to give them some sort of notes or handout on how to use evidence to be able to support your position. All right, you say this. What do you have to say to back up what it is that you said? So I have to show them how to do that skill in the first place. And then last, I have organized the information into some sort of first draft argumentative essay. You can see, again, even in this assignment, it's just a first draft. Because this is not a language arts class, I do not have prior understanding of their writing abilities. This is a history class, so I'm gonna have to take it from a very fundamental space. So what I'm going to do is give them some sort of graphic organizer that helps them to align and coordinate their thoughts into little boxes and structure it in a way that I can understand it. So that takes me to my last resource. I haven't found these things. I'm just brainstorming about what my options are. I could change any of these, but these are the ones that I've selected that I want to be able to have to give them access to each of these objectives, okay? Super, super flexible. They are the ones that you choose because there will come a time when you get to kind of like pick through what those options are and make a final decision. Also, again, this is a time where you can stop and think about if there are any other core resources and skills that you will need to be able to deliver this to your students. And then you can go back to the place where in your analyze phase, you can just add to those. All right, do we have any questions about that? All right, I see some good hot head nodding, so that tells me that we seem to be on the same page. All right, good stuff. Okay, so now we move on to the development phase. So development essentially is we are looking at the learning resources very specifically. They're no longer options. We're going to be choosing which ones we use. We're going to validate those sources to see if they are in fact the right ones for us. Because like sometimes you pull out a worksheet, and I use a very specific example of, I ran a school of my own, and I chose Singapore math as the curriculum for my students. Because I was like, Singapore math, it's so great. These people know like what they're doing. And when I started using it to teach my kids, I realized they had so many other assumptions about what students were able to do. And Singapore math is rooted in higher level skills and critical thinking, and they are not just focused on the core math skill. So being able to say, three digits by 2 digits has 490 egg cartons on the shelf, and he only needs to deliver 50 to 3 of his clients. How many deliveries would he need to make? And I was like, what? Okay, so I realized those resources weren't appropriate. They were very confusing in teaching the skills. Those were for like extended higher level practice, but not for teaching the skill that I wanted, all right? So sometimes you have to vet it and maybe do a pilot test. So walk yourself through this lesson, or give this lesson to somebody and be like, hey, finish this. Does this make sense to you? Sometimes you have to do that before deciding the resources that you use. Okay, so taking you through the process of selecting my resources. I've established that I already have the textbook for this unit. So for resource 1, which is the handout on Woods Rogers' term, what I'm going to do is essentially scan it. So I'm going to scan this document, and I'm going to deliver it as a PDF. I have an option of creating a digital link that allows my students to either access it online or download it to be able to get access to it. So boom, that's what I'm going to do for my first resource. Just scan that document and give the students access to it. Then for resource number 2, which is a timeline, event organizer, or a video of how to take notes, I actually decided I would give them a video on how to take notes, all right? So this is a video that I've chosen. I'm just gonna show you kind of like the process that I went through. So literally I used YouTube, went to my browser, typed in YouTube, and then I just clicked on YouTube.
Ms. Sanders, before you move on.
Yes.
There's a teacher whose microphone is not working, and she wanted to ask if the lesson can be done in 2 parts.
Yes.
That's something that I was thinking about, because that, with all of the steps in trying to figure out what is needed in order to achieve that learning goal, that would take it into several lessons. So the teacher's asking, can the lesson be done in more than 1 part?
You can actually use each of your objectives as an individual lesson. So when I say lesson, I'm not talking about an instructional period. I'm talking about a period from the introduction of the skill to the final assessment of that skill.
Okay.
So when I say, so for example, and again, when you're talking about a flexible context, there will be times, like some of your students, I don't know your students specifically, but like here, not all of the students in New Providence are able to sit in this classroom. Like some of those students are working at the food store right now, right? You have to be able to design your lesson in a way that if they can't sit in your class during that time, they can still come back and do your lessons in your absence. That's the beauty of flexible content. And so you can be there, you can design this lesson in this very specific way and still do a Zoom class, but your Zoom class will not be focused so much on giving them access to these materials as supporting them through the process. And so that's what your lesson is for today. So instead of, so I've given all of my students access to this Woods Rogers resource. In my Zoom class for that day, we could just literally be reading through and discussing this. I've given everybody access to the materials. The advantage is in the Zoom class for that day, we've discussed this more deeply, giving the students an extra opportunity to have discussions with me and with each other. And what I could do from that is I can record my Zoom class and still give students that extra access to it. So that's a class, but that's not a lesson. Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah, so very specifically, when I say lesson, I'm talking from beginning, introduction of skills to summative or formative, or the end of the formative assessment of that skill. You can break up how you deliver this. Because this could be this could be 4 different lessons of sorts. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I was playing how I found resource 2. If you've never gone through this process, you're truly doing yourself a disservice. Like YouTube, there's so many teachers out here who are creating content. Khan Academy has a lot of their lessons online. My son graduated from Alpha Omega Academy. So I'm a homeschool parent of sorts. And we also did North Star. And I found when he first started, he's a BTVI now. When he first started, a lot of the teachers used links from open source resources to teach their classes. So this is what I did. So I typed in the search bar. Fast forwarded a little bit. My Wi-Fi was slow on this day. And I literally just typed in how to take notes from a textbook. And I came up with multiple search results. So once my results came up, I looked through the videos and then I chose one. When I do lessons like this, I usually cap my videos at around 3 minutes. Nothing that's going to be longer than maybe 3 minutes and 15 seconds because you're going to lose them. They're not going to pay attention at all. And something that they can play multiple times by themselves. So this is what I did. I think I chose this video, and that was essentially the gist of it. So that took me to all I did was copy the link in here so that I have access to that resource later, okay? So then I want to show examples of how to use evidence to support a position or an argument. I repeated the same process. I went to YouTube. I searched, I think my very specific search result was how to use evidence to support a claim. Typed it in. I had a number of options. Again, I chose one that was under 3 minutes. You pretty much just right click, a link comes up and I pasted it here and boom. That gave me my 3rd resource. And so for the 4th one, I've established that I want some sort of graphic organizer that helps my students to organize their thoughts. And so I'm here and I've chosen this one. This is one that I found on the internet, but I've actually decided to create my own because the ones on the internet that you find are typically going to be like JPEGs or PDFs. And I want to be sensitive to the resources my students will have access to. Google is free. Google has Google Docs. So minimally, I will give them, I converted this into a Word document so that they can be able to type directly into this. Or even my students that are using a book, they can draw this and write directly into it. So that's my 4th resource. I created a link to the document because I just live in a cloud life. And these are all of the resources that I'm going to use to create my lessons. Simple as that. Okay, so I've gone through the vetting and selection process. I've decided that these ones are the most appropriate for me and my students. All right, are there any questions on that? No? All right. Okay. So the next step in the process is called the implementation. Hey, what's happening here? I usually have very good internet and all of a sudden it's showing off. we go. We're on slide 38. Okay, so now we are at the implement phase. We've gone through analyze, design, develop, and now implement. Again, implement in a regular classroom environment would just take you to the point where you're teaching this lesson. So I'm not going to go into this stage in depth because this is something that your school would need to decide from the very beginning. What I do have, and I'll give you a copy of this, I will send a copy of this slideshow for you, is links with several free platforms that you can choose to use either as a school, as a teacher. There's Schoology, which is a full learning management system. Google Classroom is very similar to that. I know lots of people like Edmodo. I am not a fan. There's Seesaw, which I actually really love, especially for primary school learners. Or you can use a website. I mentioned before, I taught history and social studies for the first time in 2006. And I realized I was wasting a lot of valuable class time with my students writing notes and having access to notes and textbooks. I created a website in 2006 for my social studies and history notes. And it's a website that still exists today because I did not have time for that. And so using a website is not necessarily a bad idea. I do recommend that your lessons live created, or using social media groups like Facebook or WhatsApp to send it to specific parents maybe. And by creating that website, I do recommend that you use some sort of platform to contain where your lessons live. Just because as teachers, that's probably not the last time you're going to teach that lesson. And it gives you the opportunity to just kind of like revisit that and make any adaptations. For example, at ORG, we have a program called Freedom School, and we do like constitutional, it's like a lesson on advocacy and lobbying for your rights and changing laws. And one of the original, so I designed this program, and again, I use the ADDIE model for it. The person who was the Freedom School presenter, she was older than I was. And so when she would rally, meet with prospective Freedom Schools or Freedom School students, she would use examples of like the labor movement and the Randall folks. When I adapted it, I started using things like Martin Luther King. So again, same content to show examples of advocacy groups and grassroots movements. The newest Freedom School manager now, he's having to use things like Black Lives Matter and the We March because that content needed to be up for the current demographic. All right, I just want to show you an example of how you can have the same, you just sometimes have to update even though you're using the same sets of skills. So as I mentioned, these are just a couple of examples. Some of you might be using more, but they are definitely places I would let your lessons live. All right. Do you guys have any specific concerns about where your classes will live or what resources you're using? Or are you even familiar with these platforms that I've shared? Is anybody, are they completely foreign to anybody?
No, you can hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Recently, I started using
Modo.
Right. And with this webinar, I could truly say that it is great to pursue learning because I realize with this, although the classes are going well and the students are responding and they're achieving my goals, what I can do is that when I write my objectives and my outcomes, I do share that with them. And when I use PowerPoints or web links, what I can do now, a step that I was missing, which other students, you know, may have a downfall from, is that I was not writing the steps in which I want them to watch the videos and I want them to read the articles and actually tell them why it's important. Because I have some students that would jump and go and complete an assignment and they feel as if, okay, I've met all these objectives, but they did not necessarily even open an article. It's like, okay, probably she put this here for extra information. I really didn't need to know that. I had prior knowledge on this before. She's probably taken a time and assigning this lesson, so I do not have to go into what the articles that she placed there for me, or the website she placed there for me, or even this PowerPoint. So now I can go back and I would have to give detailed instruction, seeing that I'm not there hands-on, because in the classroom you are there hands-on, so that if it's not detailed, they can say, the students can respond, oh, hey, Ms. Bethel, could you walk me through this? And you could correct that, but with Edmodo, if they don't know, they just don't know.
Exactly. And again, it's an oversight.
Students still will not say in a message, hey, how is it that you want this done? So again, that much from the ADDIE model. And thank you.
Good stuff. All right. Awesome. Okay. So that takes us to our next step, which is the evaluation. In a traditional classroom environment, we typically use evaluations, mostly summative assessments and formative assessments, but we don't turn that on ourselves. We often just use assignments to figure out if students got it, but we don't often think about that as like, but did I give it to them? All right. So in ADDIE, you get to look at that on both sides of the sphere. Because as I mentioned before, unclear objectives means that skills and knowledge transferred might also be unclear. In a flexible context, you have to constantly evaluate what is the impact of the learning environment that you're creating. So, for example, when you design your lesson, in addition to your summative assessment, you can identify very specific metrics or benchmarks that you can use to decide if your lesson was effective. For example, you can identify the number of students who have successfully completed your assignment, or a percentage of them who have successfully done it. So if you delivered something online and only 50% of your students got it, consider 50% your passing grade. We were missing something, so that because there was only a limited number of students that got this. What do I need to be able to revise about this lesson to improve my success rate? So that's how to think about it. The quality of the student responses. So, okay, they all did it, or most of them did it. Were their responses what I was expecting? Then you can use that to modify how you deliver this. What do I need to change? Which resources were probably not the most appropriate to give them the skills and content that they needed to deliver the assessment at my expectation level? What do I need to change for this lesson? We can also use very direct student feedback. In fact, after this, I'm going to send a link to the course survey page. So I want you to be able to respond and tell me very specifically what areas of this workshop worked for you. What would you like to see improved? Does this have any impact on your life? Like, I'm going to get that very direct feedback from you, because that is incredibly valuable. Or you can also or you can create an open forum where your students can give feedback on the assignment. So you kind of leave an open page. If you have any questions about this, you can send me a message, you can send me an email, raise your hand, just let me know if this is working for you. You can create that classroom environment where students are giving you feedback, so that you can reflect on on the learning environment that you actually created and make the necessarily adaptation. All right? Again, I know that's something that often makes us uncomfortable, and we can think of a million excuses as to why we wouldn't. It's definitely, take it with a grain of salt. It is better to know than to not know, because you can just think about the number of students that you are just incredibly disadvantaging just because you don't have the information about their experiences. All right. All right. So I'm actually going to take you through my completed lesson. Did you guys have any other questions before I walk through what the completed lesson looks like? No? Okay, let's walk through it. So when I do a lesson design, I pretty much have three very simple components. What is my lesson introduction? What are my learning activities? These are essentially my formative assessments. What is the lesson assessment? Which is my summative assessment, all right? So that's how I think about this. I keep it super, super simple. All right, so grade 10 Bahamian history. I decided to compile all of my lessons into a simple slideshow. So, hold on, who is that? I got your name here. No, what was your name? Oh, who was it that just spoke? Who spoke last? Right. What's your name again? Because when your face shows up, your name goes away. Tavina. Bethel. Right. Yes. Right. Only when you talk does your name show up. Thank you. Right.
Okay.
So even in using Edmodo, you can do something like create a slideshow and put the whole slideshow in Edmodo to give them the instructions step by step by step, so that they walk through the whole process, so that you don't have to create like multiple pages or multiple assignments. You can put it all in just one document. And in this case, that document is a slideshow. Okay, so this is my lesson to my students. I actually started off with a video, and it's pretty much just explaining all of this because I want to put a face to a process.
Good morning, class, and welcome back to Bahamian History for grade 10. It's me, Miss Tiffany, and I'm so happy to see you guys again this week. So this week we are working very specifically on Woodes Rogers' term as Royal Governor. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to select and use historical knowledge accurately to support an argument. During this lesson, you will read and become familiar with the events of Woodes Rogers' term as governor, identify and organize the key events of his term as governor, the events of Woodes Rogers' term, and form a position about its success. And then in the end, you're going to organize this information into a first draft argumentative essay, which you will send to me as the assessment or the assignment for this lesson. All right. So good luck. If you have any questions about anything, you can email me at misstiffany@orgbahamas.com or send me a message in our class WhatsApp group. Good luck. See you later.
All right, so that was the introduction. I walked through the outcomes and the lesson objectives. I made it very clear what it is that I wanted the students to do. And I also gave them an opportunity to give me any sort of feedback if they were having challenge. All right, so my slide 1 has learning activity 1. Read through the chapter, read over this chapter about Woodes Rogers' term as Royal Governor of the Bahama Island. And so when they click here, it's going to take them to the web page where I have uploaded the chapter for them to be able to either read or just download or either just read on the internet if they don't have the resource or capacity. Lots of these smaller phones, they don't have a lot of storage. And so you may find that your students don't actually have storage to download specific documents or just do them one at a time. So I have this, the textbook, I've just uploaded it here. This sometimes takes a while. Issue doesn't want me to be great. Oh, so here we go. So it's literally the whole chapter. And I go through the pages. There you go. Okay, so now for learning activity 2. So my instructions, again, are here. Reread the chapter and take notes on important events, on the important events of Woods Rogers' term. Check out this video, which will help you practice how to take good notes. So this is the video that I selected. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but as you can see, it's only 2 minutes and 50 seconds.
If you need to study a textbook but don't know where to start, then this video will show you how to take notes from a textbook in 5 simple steps. Step 1 is, before you open your textbook, find out how the assessment will be.
All right, so that's the second lesson. Again, if we're doing a Zoom classroom for this, this is day 2 of this lesson, and we can have discussion about like what observations did they make from their notes, what kind of notes did they take, and they can piggyback off of each other, maybe taking notes that some of their classmates made. So you can turn this into some sort of like a class week. So they've taken their notes, and if you're going to do a Zoom lesson, like I said, do a shared document, and they can like type in any notes that they want and that sort of thing, and then share it for maybe a student who couldn't attend that lesson. So again, I have a core lesson, but I can expand this however it is that I want to make it more elaborate if we're doing this in a class space. But the core lesson design gives everybody equal access to it. All right, so learning activity 3, which is using evidence to support a claim. Again, I have another YouTube video. Now that you've read and taken notes about Woods Rogers' term as royal governor, look at the information which you've collected. Do you think that Woods Rogers had a successful term? What evidence do you have to support this position? So now they're getting to the place where, okay, he was good or bad, or he was successful, unsuccessful. Boom, I have that. What evidence do I have? So what happened to make me say this? They start collecting that information. So I also have, watch the following video to help you better find evidence in text to support your position. So again, here's another video.
How does the author support a claim with evidence?
This is another one that's kind of like very main idea and detail. So my main idea is kind of like, he was not successful. And so my details are, these are the things which support that point. That's essentially what this video does, take them through those sorts of skills. And so the last one, this is, as you would identify, is my last objective. They're going to use this graphic organizer, which I created. I have used the graphic outline to state and explain your claim about Woods Rogers' success as a royal governor. Give 3 reasons for your position supported by evidence from the text. Identify and explain the counter position, which is an opposing view from yours, and draw a conclusion. And again, I didn't assume that they knew what a counter position was. I didn't assume that they knew what a conclusion was. These right here, I will not be grading at all. All I'm asking for, and I want to take them through the process of being able to frame up what an essay would look like. They should be able to develop this well enough that they will be able to draw from it to create some sort of essay. This is where differentiated instruction is going to happen. Your students who are at the very core of your class, they are going to pull out very literal pieces of evidence. He did this, he did this. This is where it happened. Like, that's what they're going to do. Your students to the evidence and examine the fact that he went to jail during his first term as success. They're going to be thinking about that on a higher level, whereas again, at your very core, you're going to have students who are just going to pull out this information. Did they all achieve the skill? Absolutely. Will they be able to demonstrate that knowledge on their own levels? Still, absolutely. And so this lesson was fair to everybody, and you can mark the things that made you identify what the skill level was. You're not going to be biased and use like, oh, well, this student gave me this assignment that looks like this, and you didn't, and so therefore this gets an A and this gets a C. You're going to be like, okay, did you achieve the objective? Absolutely, tick, 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 done. All right. Does that make sense? You see how it all just kind of comes together when
Hi, can you go over that point one more time? Your computer, the whole sound went out, and I know I didn't hear anything. So could you
Okay.
just go back one more time, please?
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
remember when I chose the outcome, again, the skill here is using historical knowledge to make an argument and to support it, right? Because I know this is what I'm marking. This assignment right here helps me to identify whether or not they were able to do this. Were they able to decide, create a position? I have the claim here. They explain it. Were they able to use a historical knowledge to support it? They're going to give me their position, and then they're going to give me evidence from the passage right here. When we talk about differentiated instruction, this lets me know, okay, so at the very core, my fundamental students will be able to do this. They will go into that paragraph, they're going to pull out very specific dates, and they're going to be like, he did this, like he was able to bring pirates to justice. Boom, that's the evidence. He was able to clean up Nassau. Boom, that's the evidence. He was able to restore commerce in the island. Boom, that's the evidence. You're going to have your higher level thinkers who are going to come up with much more original responses to whether or not he was successful or unsuccessful. And the example that I gave was during his term, Woodes Rogers used so much of his money that he ended up going to debtor's prison. Somebody, one of your higher level thinkers, might actually identify that as a reason he was not successful. Maybe he was not good with managing money and therefore was not a successful governor. Whereas another student who may use that same point of information, he went to debtor's jail, but was able to return to the colonies for a second term as royal governor, which is a tout to his success. So you're going to be able to get a range of responses that all achieve the objectives, but you're going to be able to measure like what your kids' abilities are in a different way from being able to identify whether or not they have achieved the practice of the skill that you've put forth to them. So again, have they all achieved the skill? Yes, they have. Have they been able to demonstrate it on their individual levels? Yes, they have. And that's essentially what you want in an assessment that's equitable, so that you're not looking at the good assignment and then marking all of the assignments on that curve of what you consider the good assignment. You actually have a very objective set of basis that you're going to be measuring this assignment on. Okay? I was clear at that time, right? Awesome. Okay. All right, so that takes us to the end of this workshop. I'm actually going to email this out to you. Sorry, so you have this template already. I'm challenging you, and I would like to continue to hear from you. I'm challenging you to be able to design your lessons this way. So use the template to walk through the process of creating another lesson. You have access to my email. We can email back and forth over the course of the next week, and I can give you any sort of feedback that you would like. I will also be emailing out to you the course survey for this, so you can kind of give us some feedback on the effectiveness of this, or if there are other workshops you would like to see from Org Education. Also, if you like this, you can go to our Facebook page and follow orgbahamas.com, and maybe let other people know about this workshop if you feel like it's one that maybe your colleagues should hear about or take, because we are offering it for free. So if you do think it's a good one, feel free to share that information and my contacts if there's anybody else that you think would benefit from the use of this workshop. All right. All right. So the last thing is I need a list because this is a certificate workshop, and I will be sending those out. So if I can get a list of everyone who has participated in the workshop, so I can have your certificates emailed out to you, please. So in the email that I send with the link to the course survey, you can maybe just send back the list of all of the participants, and I will go ahead and send that out to you. Okay. As I mentioned, you have access to my email address if you want any further support over the course of the next week, I am available to then for your participating in our workshop.
Ms. Spain, can you just give everyone your email address, please?
It's super simple. So it's Tiffany, Tiffany, at orgbahamas.com.
Ms. Spain, I really want to thank you for hosting this webinar for us. And we know that it's free of charge, and we really appreciate your sacrifice. We see that you are very knowledgeable about the information you spoke about, and we are sincerely grateful. But I just want to share, and I know you're going to send a survey, but I don't know if anybody else want to share 1 or 2 points that really stood out to them. But for me, what was an aha moment is something that I really believe in, and that's when I spoke about, or when you spoke about leading with the skill in mind, planning your lessons around the skill and not the content, because so in being in education administration for so many years, I have found that a lot of persons, a lot of teachers, I guess through no fault of their own, but it's just how they've been trained, what they've been used to doing. They teach the content, and once the content is taught, they automatically assume that the student would have acquired the skill, and that's not necessarily the case. So I want to thank you for showing us that with this model, and when you lead with the skill, you'll be able to achieve the objectives of the overall learning goal more. The students would be able to achieve those objectives. So I just want to thank you. I don't know if any other person want to share an aha moment or what they would have got.
Okay, Davina here once again. Some points I took away from the learning session here was that active learning can take place in the virtual classroom also, be it student-centered, how to take notes, because even when we get back to the regular classroom, the virtual classroom can be used interchangeably. So students that do not have the textbooks or do not have reading materials, it can be scanned and they can probably go home and use their internet. And if they don't have the core book to hold on to, they still will not be disenfranchised. They can still come to the class and still have discussions because they still would have the information. How important it is to keep the videos that you have them watch under 3 minutes. That was like, wow, you know, so that they won't go off. And it was one more point, but I'm writing all over the place. But thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to reinforce that earlier point. I will tell you, it's not a practice that we've started here yet, but you will find, last year I had the opportunity to participate in a year-long fellowship with KIPP charter schools. And a lot of those schools start where you will have like your team meeting, they start off with data meetings. And you will find, and we're all guilty of this, the content that we're more familiar with and that we like more, or the skills we know better, those are the ones we give like our heart and soul to. There are lots of teachers who are teaching things out there that they're not comfortable with, that they don't fully understand themselves. And those are like the secrets that we keep to ourselves, and we disadvantage our kids. Because the US, they use a lot of, I can't remember the term that they use. It's kind of like the skill. They don't call it the skill, but they use very specific metrics. So they identify the skills. They start off with data meetings. So they start off their planning meetings with like, okay, these are the skills we're going to do this week. What does this mean to you? How do you apply this? So when they have those data meetings and planning meetings that way, it gives teachers who didn't know that thing and might have been uncomfortable but didn't want to say it an opportunity to learn from their peers how to do that thing before we actually started teaching it so that we could learn from each other. And it's one of those things where we have to grow out of being ashamed of not knowing and being willing to share with one another, because there's something that I get. I know, like when I'm teaching kids, and if I said something 3 times and they don't get it, I often tell them to talk to each other, because I'm like, maybe I'm not speaking it in a language that you understand, and they can say it to each other and get it. So sometimes, like, even though you've read it and you've practiced it and you've watched the video, you still don't get it. You just need another person to like explain it in a way for you to do it. So I highly recommend the use of like those data meetings to go over what those objectives are going to be during that period of time and share with each other. Don't be afraid to do that, because it's super helpful to everybody. All right. All right. So again, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really good group. You guys worked super quiet, which I hope that didn't give me like a false impression of success, but I take great comfort in not seeing a lot of faces. For the faces that I could see, there wasn't a lot of like, what is she talking about? So that made me feel really good. And I thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you too.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.